The $30 million heist, how Cash Money tricked the industry. They tell artists the music business is about talent. That's the first lie. The second lie is that success means freedom. Because for decades, hip-hop artists signed contracts that look like opportunity on paper, but function like debt traps in real life. You get an advance, you get a chain, you get a car you don't own, and in exchange, the label keeps the only thing that actually matters: ownership. Masters, publishing, control. By the late 1990s, this system was perfected. Labels weren't just signing artists, they were extracting value. Music was the product. Artists were the labor. And once the labor aged out, the machine moved on. That was the environment in 1998. And that's why what happened next didn't make sense, because in that same year, two brothers from the Magnolia Projects in New Orleans walked into the offices of Universal Music Group and walked out with a deal that flipped the entire system upside down. $30 million, ownership of their masters, majority profit split, creative control, no chains attached. It wasn't just rare, it was unheard of. And if it failed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be catastrophic. To understand why this deal was so dangerous, you have to understand the rules of the game at the time. In the late 90s, the music industry was controlled by what insiders called the majors. 6 corporations controlled distribution, radio relationships, marketing budgets, and shelf space. If you wanted your CD in a store outside your city, let alone nationwide, you had to go through them. That power imbalance shaped everything. Artists were routinely signing deals where they earned 12 to 15% royalties after recoupment, which meant the label fronted money for recording, videos, promotion, and then charged the artist for it later. Most artists never recouped. They stayed famous and broke at the same time. And worst of all, the label owned the masters forever. Even if the artist walked away, even if the label dropped them, even if the music lived on for decades, that asset stayed with the corporation. This wasn't accidental, it was the business model. Now here's where Cash Money enters the picture and why they were different. Brian Birdman Williams and Ronald Slim Williams weren't chasing validation. They weren't begging for radio spins. They weren't sleeping on couches in New York hoping for a meeting. They were building something outside the system. Cash Money Records started in New Orleans, far from the traditional industry hubs. Instead of chasing majors, they chased the streets. They pressed their own records, moved their own tapes, built their own network of mom and pop shops, car trunks, and regional distribution. This wasn't hype. By the mid-90s, Cash Money was selling tens of thousands of units independently every month. Not streams, not impressions, physical units, Cash Money, literally. They had artists like Juvenile, BG, and a young Lil Wayne, building a local frenzy that labels usually spent millions trying to manufacture. And that's the key word, manufacture, because what Cash Money had was real demand. But here's the part people leave out. By 1997, Cash Money had hit a wall. Not creatively, not culturally, logistically. They were dominating New Orleans and large parts of the South, but radio wasn't opening nationally. Big box retailers were hard to penetrate without a major distributor. Their infrastructure was strong, but not infinite. They were rich by street standards. But wealth and scalability are not the same thing. Stacks of CDs sitting in warehouses don't matter if you can't move them fast enough. Momentum can stall, buzz can fade, and in hip-hop, timing is everything. Cash Money wasn't failing, but they were at a crossroads, and crossroads are where bad deals usually get signed. At the same time, the majors were watching. Executives had started noticing strange sales reports coming out of the South. Independent labels moving units that rivaled major releases, artists selling without radio, without MTV. One of the people paying attention was a Universal A&R named Dino Delvey. When Dino traveled to New Orleans to see it firsthand, what he saw didn't look like a typical independent hustle. It looked like a self-contained economy. Lines outside record stores, cash transactions, fans who already knew the lyrics before the industry even acknowledged the songs. This wasn't potential. This was proof. And Universal understood something important. If they didn't step in, someone else eventually would. Or worse, Cash Money might not need them at all. Here's where the story usually gets romanticized. People like to say Birdman and Slim got lucky. That's not true. Luck doesn't walk away from meetings. Birdman made it clear early on, if the deal didn't make sense, they would go right back to selling records out of trunks. No desperation, no bluffing. He wasn't asking for a lifeline. He was offering access, and access has a price. But knowing your worth isn't enough. Knowing the law isn't enough. And knowing the business language of corporations is an entirely different skill set. That's why the next move mattered more than any beat, any artist, any hit record. Cash Money didn't just bring leverage into the room, they brought in an architect. Cash Money had the product, they had the audience, they had the leverage, but leverage without strategy gets you crushed. Leverage doesn't come from confidence, it comes from options. And by the time Cash Money sat across from major label executives, they had something most artists never have, the ability to walk away without starving. That's the part the industry didn't fully understand. Cash Money wasn't an artist looking for a deal. They were a business deciding whether expansion was worth the risk. And that difference changed everything. In the mid to late 1990s, New Orleans wasn't considered a major hip-hop market. New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, those were the cities labels chased. The South was still treated like a regional experiment. Cash Money didn't wait for permission. They pressed records locally. They sold directly to stores. They created demand before radio ever touched the records. Juvenile wasn't a developing artist. He was already a star in the city. BG wasn't waiting for marketing budgets. The streets already knew him. Lil Wayne wasn't a child prodigy yet, but the foundation was being laid in real time. This was an assembly line, and it was working. Cash Money releases were moving 50,000 to 75,000 units a month independently. No national radio, no MTV rotation, no major label distribution. That kind of movement sent a signal. Because in the music business, numbers talk louder than talent. But here's the uncomfortable truth most documentaries skip. Independent success doesn't mean infinite success. There's a ceiling. By late 1997, Cash Money was operating at maximum efficiency within their system. They could dominate the South, but pushing into the Midwest, the East Coast, and international markets required a different machine. This wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about infrastructure, warehouses, distribution networks, retail relationships, shipping volume, manufacturing speed. Cash Money had demand. But scaling demand without slowing momentum is where most independent labels break, and that's where the majors smell blood. Because this is usually the moment artists panic. This is where they sign anything. Universal didn't approach Cash Money like saviors. They approached them like investors. They saw a company with a proven customer base, strong margins, and explosive growth potential, but limited reach. That's a dangerous combination, because when a corporation senses that you need them, they squeeze. But Cash Money didn't need Universal to survive. They needed Universal to expand faster. And that subtle difference gave them leverage most artists never have. Birdman understood something instinctively that many artists learn too late. Money without control is temporary. Control without money is fragile. The goal wasn't to get signed. The goal was to stay in control while scaling. And that meant playing a game the majors weren't used to playing: patience. Here's where Dino Del Valle becomes important again. When Dino reported back to Universal, he wasn't pitching a risky artist. He was pitching a proven operation. Lines outside stores, consistent sales, a loyal audience that didn't need to be convinced. Universal wasn't looking at Cash Money as a gamble. They were looking at them as a distribution opportunity. But even then, the majors believed the same thing they always believed. Eventually, Cash Money will blink. That's the industry's favorite assumption. They assume the artist will get tired. They assume the money pressure will mount. They assume ego will crack. They were wrong. Birdman made it clear early in conversations, if the terms weren't right, there was no deal. Not, we'll think about it, not maybe later, no deal. That silence, that willingness to walk, did more damage than any negotiation tactic. Because once you realize the person across the table doesn't need you, the power shifts. Universal could offer advances, marketing, radio muscle. Cash Money could offer proof, and proof always wins long term. But leverage alone isn't enough. You can have power and still get outplayed. This is where many independent labels fail. They walk into rooms with confidence, but no legal architecture. They rely on instinct instead of strategy. Cash Money didn't make that mistake. They brought in someone who knew how to translate street leverage into corporate language. Someone who understood contracts better than charisma. Someone who wasn't impressed by titles. Wendy Day, founder of the Rap Coalition. An advocate who had spent years watching artists get trapped by paperwork they didn't understand. Wendy didn't see Cash Money as clients, she saw them as a test case. If this deal could be structured correctly, it would prove something the industry insisted wasn't possible. That artists could retain ownership, that labels could function as partners instead of owners. That leverage, when used correctly, could rewrite the rules. Wendy's first move wasn't aggressive, it was strategic. She didn't rush Universal, she didn't threaten. She created competition. Meetings weren't about begging for offers, they were about signaling value. Wendy quietly shopped the deal to multiple labels, Sony, Epic, Geffen. Each meeting sent the same message. Cash Money isn't desperate. Cash Money is choosing. And the sticking point was always the same. Ownership. Every major label wanted the masters, every single one, because masters are forever and corporations don't like giving up forever. At one meeting, when the idea of an 80-20 split was floated, an executive reportedly laughed, not because it was impossible, because it threatened the entire system. So Wendy did something simple. She stood up. Birdman stood up. Slim stood up. They walked out. No arguing, no counteroffer, no explanation. That walkout echoed louder than any contract language because suddenly Universal had a problem. They could lose a proven revenue engine, not to another label, but to independence. And independence was no longer a joke. That's when the math started changing. Universal didn't agree because they were generous. They agreed because the downside was limited and the upside was enormous. Distribution costs were predictable. Demand was already proven. Marketing risk was minimal. If Cash Money exploded, Universal won. If they didn't, Universal still collected fees. It was no longer a question of if this could work. It was a question of who would benefit the most. And once Universal ran those numbers, the conversation shifted. This stopped being about artists. It became about terms. And that's where the real heist begins. The deal was signed in 1998, but the real story didn't begin in the boardroom. It began the moment Cash Money hit national distribution. Because leverage on paper means nothing unless it works in the real world. And this one worked immediately. Once Universal flipped the switch, Cash Money's music didn't need to be explained. It needed to be supplied. Juvenile's 400 Degrees wasn't treated like a risky debut. It moved like a product the streets had already validated. Back that ass up didn't crawl its way up the charts. It kicked the door in. Over 4 million units sold. And here's the difference that changed everything. When most artists hit platinum, they celebrate the plaque. Cash Money collected the money because they owned the masters, because they kept the majority split, because Universal was paid like a service provider, not a landlord. Every CD sold wasn't just a hit, it was equity. And Juvenile wasn't the exception. BG's Chopper City in the Ghetto moved serious numbers. Lil Wayne's The Block Is Hot went platinum while he was still a teenager. The Hot Boys weren't being developed, they were being deployed. This wasn't luck, this was a pipeline. The industry watched in disbelief because what Cash Money proved was terrifying to the old system. You didn't need a major label to create stars. You needed a major label to scale stars. And once that distinction became clear, the illusion cracked. Here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Cash Money didn't just change artist deals, they changed label math. Normally, the label owns the catalog, licenses it, and collects for decades. In this case, Universal distributed the product, took their percentage, and stepped aside. Every time a Cash Money song played on the radio, every time it was used in a movie, every time it was sampled, the checks went back to Cash Money. Not once, forever. That's the difference between money and wealth. Money shows up once, wealth shows up repeatedly, and Birdman and Slim understood that instinctively. Fast forward a few years, Cash Money is no longer just a Southern powerhouse. They're a national brand. Lil Wayne evolves from child rapper into cultural force. Then comes Drake, then Nicki Minaj. Entire generations built on a foundation laid by one decision in 1998, ownership. Now let's bring this to today, because this is where the lesson really lands. In the streaming era, artists rack up billions of plays and still argue over percentages. The delivery system changed. The problem didn't. Cash Money solved the problem before streaming existed, because they understood something timeless. If you don't own the asset, you're renting success. Some people say a deal like this could never happen today. That's only half true. What can't happen today is an artist with no leverage demanding ownership. But leverage still exists. Audience still exists. Control still exists. Cash Money didn't wait for the industry to validate them. They validated themselves first. This is the grown man lesson. Birdman and Slim didn't chase prestige. They didn't chase approval. They didn't chase titles. They chased position. They didn't want bosses. They wanted partners. And when the industry realized they couldn't bully them, it had to negotiate. Let's simplify the blueprint, because this is bigger than music. Step 1, build value independently. If you don't have proof, you don't have leverage. Step 2, be willing to walk. The strongest position in any negotiation is not needing the deal. Step 3, retain ownership, because assets outlive moments. That's why this deal still matters. It wasn't flashy when it was signed. It didn't make headlines like artist beefs. It didn't come with a trophy, but it quietly changed how power works in hip-hop, and once power shifts, it never fully shifts back. Birdman once said he knew what he was worth before he ever sat at the table. That wasn't arrogance, that was preparation. So when you hear people talk about Cash Money like it was just hit records and flashy videos, understand this. The real flex wasn't the cars, it wasn't the jewelry, it wasn't the money phones, it was the paperwork. And that's the difference between being rich for a season and building something that feeds generations. The 1998 Cash Money deal wasn't a robbery because Universal lost. It was a robbery because the industry's rules were exposed. Cash Money didn't cheat the system. They understood it better than the people who built it. If you respect ownership, hit the like button. If you believe leverage still matters today, drop a comment. And if you want more legacy business breakdowns that explain how power really moves in hip hop, make sure you're subscribed to GRAND-NÈGRE Media.